Well, welcome everybody to today's webinar. It's great to have you join us wherever you are in the world. My name is Robert Lippiatt. It's my privilege today to introduce our presenter or our thought leader as we continue our conversation around the role of education in enhancing lifelong well-being of military veterans and their families. Before I introduce our presenter today, I'd like to just remind you that if you have comments or you have resources you would like to share, please include them in the chat box. And if you have questions as we go through the presentation, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And we will get to those questions through the presentation. So it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter today. Our presenter is Darryl Cathcart. Darryl is just about to complete his Doctor of Education studies at Western University. He is a retired Canadian Army officer, and he has a particular interest, personal interest, as well as a professional interest in the role of education in enhancing outcomes for military members, veterans, and their families. So his full bio is in the info packs that you will have all received. And so it's my pleasure now to ask Darryl to share with us based on his research and the insights that he has gained. Thanks, Darryl.
Great. Thank you for that, Robert. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. I'm delighted to welcome you to this session where we'll discuss military-connected students in Canada and a conceptual framework that I've continued to work on and refine as more research comes to light. I've developed this framework for use in both post-secondary and higher education, and I'll use these terms interchangeably throughout this presentation, as this framework is applicable to both colleges and universities. Again, I just want to formally thank Robert and his team for this wonderful opportunity to increase awareness around military-connected students and have a more fulsome discussion at the end. Additionally, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Anzac Day coming up this weekend on the 25th. And it's important to me to acknowledge that important day and the remembrance and sacrifices of our Commonwealth soldiers. In Canada, military-connected learners are an understudied group of students in higher education, where there's been limited research over the last few decades. Study of Canadian military-connected students really matches the mass demobilization periods of the 20th century, where this landscape has been dormant since the end of the Korean War. Recent military operations in the 21st century and the introduction of a federally sponsored education and training benefit has reinvigorated interest in this subject area, with a number of institutions taking note. If you have a pressing question, like Robert said, feel free to include it in the Q&A box, and then we'll discuss those later on at the end. So as we begin, what I'd like to do is have a little pop quiz, and I'd like you to think about if 2 or 3 themes or areas or initiatives that you think should be included in developing a military-connected campus. At the end of this presentation, we're going to revisit this opening and see if we've either covered it, touched on it, or if you'd like to add some more thoughts on that matter. So this is what I want to cover today. Just some brief snapshots of what's going on, some themes, and I really want to focus on the academic and social support framework that I've developed and continue to refine as I move forward. I feel it appropriate at this point to frame my interest and exploration of military-connected students. As Robert said, I am a former serving Army officer. I had the privilege of spending 26 years in the Canadian Army, where I enrolled in the Royal Canadian Regiment, Canada's oldest infantry regiment. As a private soldier, I commissioned from the ranks as a senior non-commissioned officer and medically retired after 26 years just recently in 2017. I spent the majority of my time in operational units with inclusive of a number of deployments to both the Balkans and Afghanistan. When I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, not the most common diagnosis for someone my age, I turned to education in an attempt to make a successful transition from military service. While my movement through the ranks was certainly not unique, I understood the transformative power of education, where I decided on pursuing a doctorate of education in educational leadership to enable my next steps and recapture a sense of individual purpose. Shortly after I commenced my doctorate at Western University, Veterans Affairs Canada announced the education and training benefit, which then shifted my academic focus to more deliberate investigation of the role of training and education in relation to transition from the Canadian Armed Forces. As I began to explore this area, I rapidly realized there was a lack of tailored academic support for all military-connected students, and not just those veterans seeking upgrading opportunities. This work has led to the dedicated investigation of the development of a military-connected student framework, where there's a natural alignment between my interest, a new federal program, and emerging organizational attention. As we move forward, I feel it important at this point to discuss my rationale for military-connected student definition and military-connected campus. As I look at military-connected students, I do so really with two themes influencing me. One is altruistic and the other is rather pragmatic. So I've subdivided military-connected students into 6 subcategories. Those who are current serving, whether they're regular force or primary reservists, veterans, and we'll talk about veterans a little more on the next slide. Department of National Defense civil servants, the civilians that work in the department, and immediate family of Canadian Armed Forces members and veterans. I also look at foreign militaries, and this comes into play the closer the institution is to the American border. Clearly, we have a much greater concentration of foreign military veterans. Pragmatically, each one of these subcategories has access to education reimbursement schemes and funding, some a little more robust than others. So that's what's really influenced how I look at military-connected students and the definition. So military-connected campus really is just the alignment and synchronization of organizational resources. And that's just to support the unique group of students. So those are the two definitions that I'll be using throughout this presentation. As I said, I wanted to speak about the definition of veteran a little bit more. And as we know, that the definition of veteran varies from country to country. Additionally, it can be quite emotive when people start talking about the term veteran. From my perspective, the Canadian approach is rather holistic and recognizes the act of enrolling in an all-volunteer force. Notably absent in this Veterans Affairs Canada definition is any reference to operational deployments. While Canada is a quietly patriotic nation, there are a number of excellent national, regional, and local initiatives and organizations who truly recognize and support veterans. Anecdotally, there's often discussion about veterans and who served on what mission and at what time. but I would suggest that this is an omnipresent and universal discussion. I want to talk about a brief timeline for a minute. This timeline provides a snapshot of major conflicts compared to examples of veteran benefits provided during various periods. This is inclusive of an over 60-year gap in education and training supports available to all veterans. Appreciating the effect of this gap is essential to framing the problem we're having a discussion about today. For universities, the introduction of a federally sponsored veteran and education training support translates to welcoming veterans on campus in a manner not seen since the mid-1950s. The evolution of Canada's veteran reintegration support grew from land compensation to various forms of legislated assistance, along with federal education and training initiatives between 1915 and 1956. While providing support for ill and injured veterans is an enduring obligation of Veterans Affairs, the deliberate facilitation of veteran post-secondary education has been dormant for over 60 years. The Veterans Affairs Canada Education and Training Benefit signifies a key element within a national reinvestment in a veteran transition strategy. As a result of this recent benefit, there has been limited Canadian research on contemporary veterans. And as we know, by comparison, the United States introduced a funded post-secondary option at the end of World War II, which has continuously evolved and shaped to reflect the needs of their population. The desired outcome of sponsored education and training is to provide veterans with a renewed sense of purpose, autonomy, and increased employment competitiveness upon a return to the civilian workforce. To fill this previously identified gap, the Veterans Affairs Canada Education and Training Benefit debuted in 2018 with robust offerings that are commensurate with the amount of time served. For veterans, unless forced to retire as a result of a medical issue, where rehabilitation and education funding will be provided, there were no other forms of social programming. This includes access to unemployment insurance that could financially assist members during pursuit of a college diploma or university degree. The education and training benefit provides two different ranges of support, just over $42,000 for those who served 6 or more years, and just over $84,000 for those who served 12 or more years. The intended use of this stipend is to cover tuition, education materials, and a funding model that is applied to aid with some living expenses. In other words, qualifying veterans can attend a chosen program and experience a lessened financial burden. So if we think about this just a little bit more, if a soldier joined the Canadian Armed Forces at 18 years of age, the first funding window translates to that individual being 24 or 25 years old. And the second funding window, that individual will be 30 or 31 years old. In terms of military terms of service, that's what we call contracts. Regular force members are enrolled for a 3-year period. They have the opportunity to re-sign for another 3-year period. So that means they face a decision point at the end of the 6 years where they can leave the Canadian Armed Forces, qualify for the education and training benefit, and go off to college or university. Conversely, to qualify for the $84,000, service members are not pensionable after 12 years, and they're in between terms of service. They're in between those contracts. This may mean that we'll see some more seasoned veterans on campus later on. So if we just look at the stats on the right-hand side of your screen, as I said, the education and training benefit, the ETB, was released in 2018. Just over 7,000, nearly 7,100 applicants have applied for the benefit, and nearly 4,200 veterans are enrolled in some programming at a college, university, or in a flight school. So clearly, there's a desire for this benefit, and veterans are using it. There are some other funding avenues that exist where the Canadian Armed Forces has a number of fully sponsored and education reimbursement programs available. These are offered to both officer and non-commissioned officers in terms of various enrollment schemes, along with in-service opportunities. D&D, the civilians who work for the Department of National Defense, also have education reimbursement programs. And for the dependent child, spouse, or partner of a service member who is killed or severely wounded or injured as a result of military service, they may qualify for Veterans Affairs Canada support. So all of this feeds back into what influenced my definition of military connected students. Let's shift gears just a little bit and allow me to provide a brief snapshot of some ongoing efforts across the country. The subject of military connected students is gaining attention in various ways from coast to coast. This ranges from full cross-campus implementation of academic and social supports to the exploration of prior learning and transfer credits, the development of targeted online offerings and tailored courses, the exploration of policy in terms of how to best support military connected students. A number of working groups and exploratory committees have been formed. A number of bursary and scholarships are available. An increasing number of memorandums of understanding between institutions and local military formations have been signed and explored. And there is some research that is ongoing in Canada at this point. I do not have a monopoly on all of the initiatives which are underway. However, what I'm confidently suggesting is that the landscape is shifting. This positive shift is manifesting in different forms, from looking at one element of the student population, veterans, to more holistic approaches that look at all military connected students and their relationship with the institution, the community, and their individual futures. To support a military connected student investigation, I often front load the rationale by focusing on what makes this underrepresented group unique and different from traditional students in higher education. Given the lack of Canadian specific data, I often look to the US and Australian studies, a good Harvey et al. Study in 2018 from Australia, where reoccurring themes emerge. I just want to talk about two of these elements. A common start state is to consider the lived experience of military connected students, where the discipline and structured nature of military service dissipates upon enrollment in higher education. As educators become more aware of military connected students, they are better positioned to support them through things such as tailored intake sessions, prior learning assessments, flexible enrollment policies. Moreover, as educators become aware of the differences in terms of the military connected students on campus, they realize that all military service environments are not the same. Meaning, there could be two junior non-commissioned members who served for an equal amount of time. They will have a different lived experience. Further, as institutions appreciate the difference between the still serving elements, the regular force and the reserve force, they are better armed and better positioned to meet the unique learning needs of these two communities. Military connected students bring a great deal of adaptive value to the learning institution. From contributing to in-class discussions or participating in student governments, a different perspective is realized. This adaptive value may extend to influence on the program, on the faculty, and the learning environment writ large. So to begin to frame how I continue to develop and refine my military connected framework, it serves us well to understand where I started. Veterans Affairs Canada developed a well-being framework that considers how a person is doing in transition in 7 different domains. While education is not a standalone pillar, VAC, Veterans Affairs Canada, has included it under the life skill and preparedness theme. I felt that for educators and military connected students, we could unpack this theme a little more with a view of developing a customizable and scalable framework for higher education. I also considered other well-being frameworks, such as the Canadian Public Health Agency, which further influenced my approach. So my framework rationale, in considering the what, the why, and how a military connected student framework was to be developed, I laid out my rationale, which included a pathway, the recognition, support, and tailorability. These elements were important to me and play a crucial role in the military connected campus framework. In doing so, this enabled a clear vision on a pathway which considers the anticipated rationale and expectation of military connected students who want to be more competitive in the civilian market, while simultaneously recognizing that some military connected students have entered higher education because they're seeking upgrading for military career implications. To synchronize institutional efforts, increased cross-campus awareness must be considered that speaks to the student, faculty and staff, and surrounding community. Clearly, the rationale for this framework must be grounded in an academic and social support. Therefore, efforts must be considered on how this will be achieved. Finally, the tailorability aspect is important, as my conceptual framework is not dependent on one element of the military connected student population, and it can be adapted at the university and college level, regardless of the geographic location of the school. The desired outcomes of this investigation and implementation are focused on military connected students and how higher education can support their independence, achieve a greater sense of purpose, and contribute to their overall well-being. So if we briefly look back at some known and ongoing initiatives in Canada, I feel like there's some validation in the aforementioned aspect of my presented rationale. Further, having appreciation what's happening across the country, the tailorability of my approach is underscored. So I want to spend a little time on talking about my military connected campus framework. In developing this customizable academic and social support framework, I focused on 7 mutually supporting themes. Again, these pillars are as a result of considering the Veterans Affairs Canada 7 domains of well-being, and I want to talk about each component of this framework. In conducting a needs analysis, we can determine the population of each service environment, which then influences how we approach the projected learning requirements. There may be opportunities to condense offerings and programming to meet the needs of a military community, or conversely, in regions where the primary reserve population is greater, we can look at how to support these individuals in the event of domestic military operations or activities such as bolstering local COVID responses. We can also cultivate relations with local or regional Canadian Armed Forces transition groups. This is a new organization in Canada that stood up a couple of years ago to help military members transition to the civilian world. Additionally, we can liaise and work with honorary colonels and lieutenant colonels, as well as investigating partnerships with other higher education institutions and even in situ professional military education schools. By looking at the established relationships through a military connected lens, The concept is to bolster existing community services. This includes leveraging services such as employment, housing, and referral. And the community service element also looks to cultivate new relations and partnerships with local or regional Veterans Affairs Canada office, operational stress injury clinics, and even military family resource centers. In doing so, this contributes to the holistic view of this approach. Academic support is the cornerstone of this framework, where a number of areas should be explored, from flexible admission, withdrawal, and hold policies, and the development of specialty programs and micro-credentials. Additionally, this pillar is influenced by the need to generate awareness across the institution, which is recommended to be done through tailored workshops, information centers, and targeted liaison. Faculty, staff, and administration. This is the group that's on the front line and really form the backbone of the military college student experience. By developing key mentorship relations and fostering networking opportunities, this creates an authentic environment which contributes to the overall positive organizational culture. The formation of communities of practice further support this pillar. The outreach, retention, and graduation pillar is directly tied to institutional recognition, where deliberate attraction, both in traditional and non-traditional forms, can be explored, dependent on the geographic location of the learning institution. This may manifest in a form of greater online or a hybrid focus, or exploring certain elements of the military connected student, meaning looking at just primary reservists and veterans, or looking at a regular D&D employees and regular force military connected students. This pillar must also consider how student life looks like for military connected students through elements such as the student government and alumni association. It's important to have the military connected students involved in the process, where their soft skills such as leadership, communication, and critical thinking can be of value on committees and informing peer support networks. In doing so, we are empowering the students to be a voice for their own needs. By raising institutional awareness, we can also contribute to their wellness through a better educator understanding of local, regional, and nationally services available to military connected students. A desired effect to be achieved in the exploration of this component is to set the conditions for an inclusive learning environment which encompasses the vast demographic of the projected military connected student population. Finally, by looking at the current partnered organizations through a military connected lens, there's an opportunity to reinvigorate and create new linkages, whether they're in the civilian sector, defense industry, or charities. This may result with the prospect of greater networking opportunities, internships, employment, or purpose-built scholarships and bursaries. On the advocacy and support side, the idea is to leverage in situ associations such as the Royal Canadian Legion, the Army, Navy, Air Force Association. Royal Canadian Legion is the largest in Canada. Army, Navy, Air Force is rather big in all provinces. As well, we can look at other unit associations, whether they're based at the base level on a military occupation specialty or other service associations that may be present in the local area. These are examples of the framework sub-elements that should be explored in order to create the most effective and efficient academic and social support model. In doing so, potential military connected students will be immersed in an inclusive environment which positively contributes to their learning. So Inherent in this framework is the ability to scale and tailor efforts to match the student needs with the local community situation. So as an example, in an environment that is predominantly regular force Navy, perhaps there's not a great consideration to explore Canadian Army reservists. Or perhaps the college or university is located where there's no Veterans Affairs Canada, operational stress injury clinics, or military family resource centers, then alternate avenues of support will need to be considered. Another example could be after initial consideration, there may be no appetite to develop specialty or fast track degrees or a need to review curriculum. Therefore, we put these on the shelf and we can discuss these at a later date. Another example of tailorability may manifest in realization that military connected students can be enveloped into ongoing initiatives at the college or university. Therefore, duplication of efforts need not be expended. Finally, there may not be a strategic desire to court defense industry or as partners, or an understanding that certain veteran advocacy groups do not exist in the local area, so we don't explore these. Ultimately, by conducting a deliberate and detailed analysis surrounding the 7 pillars of this military connected campus framework, a customizable solution can be developed. Out of the needs analysis that's conducted in concert with the aforementioned framework, an exposure and cost matrix is developed. So exposure, I'm looking at things like reputation and credibility of the institution, student well-being, and cost is defined more traditionally in terms of in time, finances, and personnel. The population of this matrix, which is delineated by stages or phases, begins to shape the institutional implementation plan. I don't want to go through the entire example, but let's speak about a couple of these initiatives. An initial step may be develop an institutional exploratory committee where institutional buy-in is generated and the investigation begins and by soliciting cross-campus input. Also, this is an opportunity to identify quick wins and generate momentum and interest. So moving from this preliminary step, and if we look to the top right-hand corner of your screen, later initiatives can include the development of specialty degrees, fast-track degrees, formalized memorandums of understanding with other local higher education institutions, and even the inclusion of a full-time on-campus military-connected student advisor. The outcome of the cost of the exposure and cost matrix is an implementation timeline. This is formed through the alignment of activities that are identified on the previous matrix, and it's nested into phases where a reasonable timeline begins to emerge. Dependent on the number of variables, a series of questions will begin to percolate. How long will this implementation take? 12, 18, 24 months? At what point will it become sustainable? Does this implementation coincide with a new academic year, or does it begin off cycle? So the final few slides, I'd like to highlight some ongoing and planned activities. First, in the fall of 2019, I approached Fanshawe College, which is located in southwestern Ontario, with this military connected campus framework idea. Fanshawe already had a number of supporting initiatives underway, and they were extremely supportive and willing to build a holistic academic and social support model. At Fanshawe in London, Ontario, the expected military connected student population was based upon the proximity to a reserve brigade headquarters and a number of primary Army Reserve units. There was also a known number of Canadian Armed Forces veterans who lived and retired in the area. Today, I'm delighted to be publicly announcing a new partnership with Loyalist College, which is located in Eastern Ontario. Loyalist is also very keen to build a holistic academic and social support model, and more discussion will take place on this direction. The expected military-connected student population will be influenced by Loyalist's proximity to Canada's largest Royal Canadian Air Force base. There are a smaller number of Army reservists and a sizable number of veterans who live in the area. Additionally, I'm in continued negotiations with another college in Ontario, where the expected military-connected student population will be influenced by its proximity to a regular force base, a smaller number of reservists, and a smaller number of veterans that live in the area. Lastly, I've been working with an Ontario university where there are pockets of interest, but there's a strategic struggle for momentum. While I'm highly optimistic that this project will materialize, a number of further discussions will need to take place. So I want to talk about Fanshawe for a couple of slides and just a bit of a case study as to the great work that's being conducted by the team at Fanshawe College. Despite our enthusiasm and desire to begin the military-connected college exploration and implementation, COVID clearly had a negative impact on the rollout. This translated to a late winter, spring 2020 investigation, which afforded more time to spend internally on raising awareness, but less time to immediately defining the military-connected student population. During last summer in 2020, we solidified the foundation of the military-connected college through a number of internal workshops, presentations, and external networking opportunities. When the 2020-2021 academic year began, we immediately surveyed the students at the college, and 124 self-identified. Of the 124, all categories of the military-connected student definition were represented, so we're pretty happy to see that. And this represented both former serving officers and non-commissioned officers. As we break down their affiliation, the greatest number was affiliated with the Canadian Army, followed by the Royal Canadian Navy, and then the Royal Canadian Air Force. Of those who identified their gender on the survey, 40 identified as women and 82 as men. All faculties were represented. Military-connected students were enrolled in 69 different programs. So this was quite encouraging for us, understanding that military-connected students were not just going into traditional, what we thought was traditional law enforcement, public security type programming. The School of Business had the highest number of military-connected students enrolled with 24, public safety with 15, and then information technology with 11 students. While I could speak about Fanshawe College for an entire presentation, a few notable elements began to fuse their approach. This includes an academic promise, which navigates the space between like school policy and the realities of being a military-connected student. This promise aims to reduce conflict and anxiety surrounding competing interests between those military commitments for serving members and academic due dates. Also, this promise includes provisions of support for veterans that are not explicitly stated in its current college policy. This policy was put into, this promise of support was put into effect just a few weeks ago, where a primary reservist had an opportunity to attend an unplanned course, and she was able to finish her studies 3 weeks early with the support of the program and the faculty, and clearly of the college. And she was able to meet both her academic requirements and her military requirements. So this was great to see that promise was put into place. Additionally, on the right-hand side of the screen, Fanshawe College has started a number of initiatives, and this doesn't include all of them, but most notably, they've started a military connected student club, which is bolstered by a speaker series that quickly gathers all the military connected students in one place. Over the past few months, I had the privilege to work with some amazing thought leaders, as Robert calls them. First, Graham Cable, Mike Allman, and I collaborated on a paper that was recently published in the Journal of Veteran Studies. In this paper, we make the case for increased attention in the United Kingdom and Canada surrounding military connected students. I've recently collaborated with a brilliant PhD candidate, Shannon Hill at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, on a paper where we call for an identification and educator awareness strategy concerning military connected students in both K-12 and higher education systems. While we acknowledge that these two populations are different, we argue that they face similar challenge within their respective realms. I'm also delighted to be part of a working group that is led by Robert Summerby Murphy, the president of St. Mary's University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And this is really a great opportunity to contribute to a consortium of universities who are exploring military connected students on the East Coast of Canada. Finally, I'm pleased to announce that I've partnered with Fanshawe College and Helmets to Hard Hats. Helmets to Hard Hats is a nonprofit which links primary reservists, veterans, and senior cadets to the skilled trades industry in Canada. We have been awarded a rather healthy grant to explore and develop a tailored pathway from military service to formal education to the skilled trades apprenticeships. While we cannot formally identify the sponsor at this point, this year-long grant was awarded just a few weeks ago, and more news will be published shortly. So the inclusion of veterans as part of a federally sponsored education program is a phenomenon that has not been witnessed in Canada for over 6 decades. For me, this uncovered a gap of knowledge surrounding all military connected students where two mutually dependent issues converged. One, policy education, and two, an understanding of military connected student needs. Ultimately, a balanced and deliberate approach is required to create a sustainable military connected student academic and social support model. When I consider some next steps, I look to increasing awareness across post-secondary institutions and their supporting elements. I also encourage collaboration between institutions, researchers, and practitioners. And finally, I look to generate and create momentum surrounding military connected students. Military connected student support in Canada is in its early days after decades of dormancy. In supporting military connected students in higher education, we are contributing to a recapturing of that individual sense of purpose and better enabling transition. As we move to the discussion portion of this presentation, I ask that you review your self-administered pop quiz. I'm going to look at the Q&A here in a second, and I encourage you to share some of your preliminary thoughts with us. I want to thank you for your time, and I look forward to your participation and comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Darryl. Great thoughts there, and also some very thought-provoking aspects or dimensions to the presentation, which hopefully people online will draw out for us. If not, I've written a few notes here because I've got some questions for you to ask. We might go to the Q&A box first, and the first question is, Darryl, Is the education and training benefit focused or limited to higher academic qualifications, or does it also include benefits to spend on more vocational or hands-on qualifications?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's focused on everything from what's called a short course. So if you think of a boot camp or some sort of very minor qualification, to college degrees, to postgraduate degrees. So it really spans spans the gamut in terms of opportunities for veterans as they move into use that education and training benefit. So it's a really great, robust benefit.
Hmm. And how important do you think initiatives like the benefit is in encouraging more military connected students to see education as a pathway? And it was interesting you showed in the Canadian experience, which marries up, I think, closely with all the other parties in the Five Eyes, except the Americans, where we did the education piece after World War II, and then it disappeared, and we've had this big gap. But how important do you think it is?
Yeah, I think it's something that reduces, it's an opportunity that reduces barriers to education. Um, the benefit is robust. It's really well put together, but it certainly will not cover all living expenses for those individuals going off to college or university. So while it does cover tuition and education materials and some other expenses, you certainly cannot live off of it. That's $84,000 over the length of your program, or 42. So it does reduce some barriers. I think it encourages folks to apply. And although there's limited research, just by looking at the numbers and seeing the use, the number of applicants in 2 years, considering that roughly 5,000 regular force members leave the Canadian Armed Forces every year, I think that's a pretty encouraging number to have nearly 7,100 applicants in 2 years. I think that really signals what folks are thinking. So I think it reduces barriers. Not all, doesn't eliminate the barriers, but it certainly reduces some significant financial barriers.
Mm-hmm. And I noticed in your stats, you 7,100 roughly had applied, but over 4,000 were actually enrolled. And as you say, with 4,000 over 2 years out of a pool of 10 is not a bad strike rate anyway. So a follow on to that is that a question is, at what stage of the individual's life do you see the benefit being most used? And I guess I'd add most beneficial to the individual.
Yeah, that's great. I don't have a lot of research on that from especially from Veterans Affairs Canada. But what I can tell you from the Fanshawe experience is that it really covers the spectrum of those newly enrolled primary reservists, all the way to folks who served 25 and 30 years of service in the military. So Fanshawe has witnessed a huge swath of military connected students enroll. Of the 124 military connected students at Fanshawe College, 28 of them are sponsored by Veterans Affairs Canada. So again, that shows that in the very localized area that this benefit is being used, and there's a great appetite for this benefit. So at this point, I'd be hesitant to put my finger on a certain number, given just what I saw at one college to date.
Mm-hmm. You raised a very interesting point there, Darryl, in that you said out of the numbers, only 28 were being funded through the formal benefit that you talked about. So how important do you think, and you talked about a range of things that the university and colleges could and should offer. So how important do you think is the other aspects of the offering, and which of those aspects do you think are the most important aspects from a student perspective or a potential student's perspective?
Yeah, I certainly think that, prior learning assessment recognition is important. Some attractive academic options in terms of policy, how folks are enrolled, how we can meet the needs of those individuals who are still serving in case of a deployment or a call out, or an unexpected training opportunity. How an institution can really and truly support their needs without any real academic penalty. I think that's important. And I also think that the social support is important. At Fanshawe, we conducted a number of focus groups with survey participants, and a reoccurring theme, was just being that one student, a 43-year-old male, said, how am I supposed to fit in with 18-year-olds? So we're really trying to cultivate social support that spans, again, the gamut for all of the military connected students. So that element of social support and that element of academic, and to see where military connected students can truly be supported, and how a college or university can do that. I think that's important. In terms of veteran advocacy, try and encourage membership in groups, try and get them involved in student life, which is difficult during these times here. But at our last speaker series event, at Fanshawe College about a month ago or 6 weeks ago, we had over 50 people attend. So that's pretty good in these, restricted times. So those couple of elements I think is important.
And just before we go to another question, a note has come in from a representative of Fanshawe backing up your comments and saying that they're very proud to support the initiative and appreciate the leadership and advice that you're providing to them. And they're hopeful that more students or more potential students, military connected students, will choose post-secondary as a future career path. So that's great that from a college point of view that they're seeing a benefit to the things that you've been talking about today. There's a question here, Darryl. Has there been an attempt to correlate military connected staff and faculty with a drive to increase numbers of military connected students? So in other words, I guess that's two parts to the question. One is identifying military connected staff and faculty, and then their role in actually helping to build the infrastructure within the university or college to support students, and also to connect with students and potential students.
Yeah, absolutely. We conducted a staff administration and faculty survey, as part of raising awareness. Conducted, what I call military 101 sessions to educate folks on military connected, on the Canadian Armed Forces and military connected students, and a couple of interesting byproducts happened out of that. Naturally, those folks who are former serving military gravitated towards the project anyway, and contacted us, asked how we can help, and networking opportunities. We have one faculty member, one associate dean, who reviews and helps out with the prior learning assessment recognitions, and his help is invaluable. Another thing happened out of these sessions is that a number of folks who were not military connected, they didn't have prior service. They really had nobody in their family with prior service, volunteered to help out the project in whatever way they could. So they came on board and using their faculty, staff, or position at the college to say, hey, I can now tailor my services this way. I can now do this for military connected students. And a great example are, an employment advisor. Clearly, as students graduate, that's the next logical step. So to have folks like that on board is certainly helpful. And that was, one of the intended consequences of sending out the survey and increasing cross-campus awareness. So although we were unable to implement the military connected college as we wanted because of COVID, this afforded some extra time to really synchronize faculty and staff efforts. So it really turned out well.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Darryl, because we've heard in the first presentation that kicked off our discussion around this topic of education about the value that actually military connected faculty brought to the institution, regardless of the other value about engaging with military connected students. So I think it's an interesting dimension that I think we need to be exploring a bit more about what value those people bring to the institution itself, aside from the things that you talked about. Another question here, you talked about helmets to hard hats as a program. And the question is are there other programs similar to helmets to hard hats for veterans not interested in the skilled trades? Or do you see opportunities for similar programs if you're not aware of any that exist at the moment?
Yeah, I think the space is wide open for other programs to come in. So in the province of Ontario recently, the provincial government has allocated a significant amount of funding to healthcare workers and all of the supporting elements surrounding healthcare workers. So there's a program called a developmental support worker program. They reached out and contacted us and see how we can kind of tap into our military connected network to bolster support in that one very niche program. The partnership with Helmets to Hard Hats is very interesting in that they've been around since 2011, 2012, and Fanshawe College was the first college in Canada to formally partner with them. And clearly I jumped on there as well, seeing, exploit success and seeing how well that was developing. So it's a unique pathway. And although they facilitate their primary, mission and task is to facilitate folks into the skilled trades, they also look at helping out the supporting elements of that as well. So not just those skilled workers. They look at other the supports that enable the other jobs and opportunities that enable those skilled trades. So yeah, I hope that answers your question, Robert.
One thing that has come up on the stream here is about female veterans, and you talked about the split in the stats at Fanshawe. So what have you observed about the female students coming out of the military connected community versus the males? Are there any differences, or if there are, what sorts of things are more important to the women?
Yeah, so unfortunately, given the nascency of this project, we haven't looked into that in any great depth at this point in time. What I didn't mention in the presentation, I said a couple of times that COVID really impacted our initial plan, our initial timeline. We did conduct another survey when we launched it, just prior to launch in about April or May of last year. So not the best time. Students are moving off to exams, they're graduating, but we sent out a quick survey to try and get a feel. We're just moving into COVID, everybody moving online. In that survey, there were more women participants than men. So we were getting excited and looking at this early data. And when we did the full survey at the beginning of the academic year, we're still very excited with the amount of women who are military connected. So we don't have any greater data than that at this point in time. It's something certainly we want to look into, but it's still still on our agenda to further explore.
Mm-hmm. Another question here, Darryl, and the question is does Veterans Affairs Canada support colleges and universities with mental health or other support for transitioning veterans, or is the support limited to the benefit paid to eligible military connected students?
Yeah, so I wanted to cover a lot in my presentation. There's a couple of things about the benefit I didn't cover. First of all, it's taxable, right? So that's problematic when we're looking at, oh wow, that $84,000 sounds like a lot of money, but by the time you pay tuition and some education materials, it's a taxable benefit, and veterans need to be aware of that. It's something we talk to folks about all the time when we're talking a little more in depth. In terms of supports, one of the things we try not to do, and I recommend to colleges and university, is that duplication of effort. We certainly don't want to do that. So, by leveraging the in situ well-being supports in this case, have that as the initial point of contact at the college or university. Dependent on the category of military connected students, each one of those individuals has access to different national services. So the main point of contact is at the local college or university. In the event something is more complex or an individual feels more comfortable, certainly there are other nationally available resources, whether it's from the Canadian Armed Forces or Veterans Affairs Canada. The last thing we want to do, we want to reduce the amount of touch points and have that, and not be passing the student around, have them access well-being supports at the most convenient point for that military connected student. So yes, there are services available at the national level, so one of the other things about the education and training benefit, a recipient doesn't have to be case managed. The money goes from Veterans Affairs Canada to the student, who's then responsible to pay his or her bills. So a couple of things like that I didn't cover in the presentation, but certainly we don't want to duplicate any efforts for a lot of good reasons.
Mm. Another question here is about the question is these are great initiatives for the Canadian military connected community. The question is there a strategy to inform military connected students or the community of these programs? And if not a national program, what's the role for the institution involved and their local community So I guess it's a
Yeah,
question around the engagement and making people aware of the opportunity.
yeah, that's right. So, the way I look at it is it's a student-centric initiative. It's a student-centric framework by building those supports at the college, university level for that military connected student. So, as part of that framework is looking at how we can market the military connected campus to the local and regional potential military connected student population. Certainly, Veterans Affairs Canada does a very good job at advertising the education and training benefit. I briefly talked about what's called the Canadian Armed Forces Transition Group. They do a great job as well in terms of informing, releasing, transitioning service members about these opportunities. And there are a number of programs that Canadian Armed Forces programs that really highlight and raise awareness about these things. Nationally, there's certainly space for colleges and universities to work together, whether it be on the regional level or, I look to the East Coast and St. Mary's, who's leading a consortium of universities, and I think they'll eventually get there once they move this down the line a little bit. So independently, there are a number of activities, but certainly the onus is, the way I see it, the onus is on the college or university to include military connected students in their, attraction and recruiting campaigns.
Hmm. And we received a comment on the chat stream from a senior academic leader in one of the universities in Canada that I think you're working with, who's supported your comment around the importance of not necessarily duplicating services, but engaging, which was a point you raised in your presentation, actually engaging with existing national and provincial and local services, and bringing them into the equation in terms of this population in the university and college setting, and to start to look at how you mobilize off some of the words used here, incredible supports that are available to meet the needs of veterans. So I just wanted to mention that because I think that point you raised is a really good one, in that we automatically assume we have to duplicate and create something specific when there may be excellent resources already available, and the issue is how do we engage them. You talked about that, and that's a good segue into the next question. You talked about engaging with a number of parties in your military connected campus framework, and one of those was the community itself that the institution sits within. So the question is how do you build those links with the community and bring in all of the relevant organisations and groupings within the community to help support, particularly not just all military connected students, but those from backgrounds like Indigenous or minority groups that are in the community. So do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, it goes back to that, no need to duplicate efforts. By looking at the existing services that are on campus, whether it's an Indigenous center or employment opportunity services, and speaking and creating and cultivating authentic relationships, and educating the separate organizations on what it means to be a military connected student, we can now further shape how these conversations go. So that's how we do it. We haven't run into any pushback, any significant obstacles. So that's that's internal to the organization, internal to the college or university. Externally, if hasn't been a relationship established between the institution and the external service, it's again by reaching out and creating that linkage and starting to cultivate partnerships. It ties back into marketing and attraction. Once Fanshawe College, as an example, announced that it became a military connected college, folks, organizations, agencies started to call the college and find out how they could be part of it, whether it was through networking, whether it was through the offering of a tailored bursary for military connected students, or whether it was for employment services, folks wanting to hire more veterans. So that marketing and those public announcements really started to bring people into the college. So it was a bit of both the college reaching out and folks seeing what was going on and then wanting to be part of it. So some really good results happened for them and for Fanshawe College.
Another question here is there a time bar or expiry date on the grant? And the person is from the UK, and where they do have a time limit to take up and use the grant. And the second part they raised, which I'll ask you to comment on, was that often people don't know when they leave, or they're in the process of transitioning, what it is they want to do, so may not take up the offer straight away. So two elements about the time bar and how important do you think it is that there is a reasonably flexible time to accommodate that group of potential students who at the point of departure really don't have a clear idea of where they want to go and what they want to do?
Yeah, it's quite generous. It's 10 years after release. So because the benefit was just launched in 2018, it actually predates that. It goes back to the new Veterans Charter that was launched in 2006. So really, that's the benchmark. So if folks were honorably released from the Canadian Armed Forces, they have a certain period, which is longer than 10 years, to start accessing their education and training benefits. So somebody can leave the military, be undecided, as you say, and come back 2 or 3 years later, and then apply for the education and training benefits. So it is quite flexible at that point in time. So so it's pretty good.
I guess that leads another question that comes to my mind is about how do we engage with military connected members or the community to start to share with them about opportunities, not just the benefit per se, but what various institutions are offering. So in other words, at what point is that useful to be thinking about doing? And B, what sorts of things do you think from your personal experience, but also talking to other military connected students, are important for them as part of that messaging to hear, to help them to think about, this as an option one, and then two, what it is that they might do?
Yeah, so I think on the first part of your question, there are some really good initiatives between Veterans Affairs and the Canadian Armed Forces in terms of educating and really enforcing the options and identifying those options that are available for those members who are transitioning. So that's really well done today. It wasn't always like that. It continues to evolve, and there are a number of great opportunities there. In terms of messaging, that's challenging. I think I'm biased, but by reading so much American literature, and with the lack of Canadian empirical data, I don't think I can give an honest assessment or an accurate assessment just because I've read so much American literature. I'd like to come back to that question in a couple of years. As all the institutions a number of institutions across Canada are taking note that the landscape is really shifting. I think that would be more of a fair opportunity at that point in time. I can just go back to those numbers and looking at how many veterans have applied, and looking at the different programs that veterans, whether it's at the undergrad, postgrad, flight school, that they're really seeking those opportunities. The other thing that's challenging, so that's on the veteran side of the house. The other thing that's challenging in terms of Canadian data are all of those reservists and regular force members who continue to serve. Because I identified a gap in terms of a lack of supports for all military connected students, we really don't have a good idea and a good sense of how many reserves are enrolled in college and university. We don't have other than the official Canadian Armed Forces sponsored programs, a number of sponsored postgrads all across the country. The Canadian Armed Forces has a good sense of that data. But folks who are seeking education upgrading and they're still in the regular force, we do not have a good sense on those numbers. So I think that's hard to speak to at this point in time. But as we increase momentum and generate awareness, I think we can eventually get some good study out of this.
The other group that often comes up when we talk about education that is educationally and employment disadvantaged are spouses and partners, but particularly because of the posting cycles. How do you see their needs versus people who, as you said, are serving as regulars or reservists or who have left the forces? Do you see a difference for that group versus those who've worn the uniform, or are they similar?
And I think that speaks to like the altruistic reasons why I feel compelled to include D&D civil servants and family members. Again, I don't have the data because of the lack of Canadian study, but just through personal experience and understanding, that the transitions that military families make, knowing the amount of family members who work for the Department of National Defense and their children who are impacted by those continuous transitions, I think it's important to include those in the definition so we can support that group as well. So, although we don't have the data anecdotally, we know it's a good thing to support those two groups. We want to support those two groups. So why not include them and look at them, from that inclusive, education perspective. I think that's important.
Mm-hmm. And another question here, Darryl, is from someone working at the institutional level, the university and college level. They say, we've noted the strong desire for member professional development to be recognised for credit, so the recognition of prior learning. And this is sometimes a barrier to entry. Can you comment on your thoughts on addressing training, credit recognition, or prior skills acquisition in the military as part of the pathway or part of the student experience?
Yeah, I think that's very important, and I think it plays out on a couple of different ways, couple of different levels. First is that recognition for credit. I think that certainly is important, but it also serves as an attraction tool as well. If a learning institution is there and it's standing behind its military connected framework, and is promising academic prior learning assessments being conducted, and folks getting looked at for that, I think that serves as an attraction tool, especially when we look at online opportunities, where that military connected student doesn't necessarily have to be in that city or town where the college is at. How it works, I think we go back to enlisting help from that institution, and really educating them on the opportunities that the Canadian Armed Forces has in terms of courses. The military has over 3,000 courses and qualifications and certifications. How do they get translated? There are a number of initiatives that are going on in Canada at the national level, but certainly it's still in its early days, where there's not one system that's being used to recognize a credit from one institution to another. This is being worked on, it's being discussed, it's being explored. But certainly that's an important aspect of developing a military connected college campus. I think that certainly is an important aspect. Oh, I think you're on mute, Robert.
I am. Thanks for that. We've got another question here, and the question is, wondering if the framework considered awareness among other students attending the higher education or post-secondary institution, and you highlighted in your presentation about awareness in that study you did with the Queen's team around faculty, staff and admin in K-12. And it's often discussed, the question goes on, that civilian peers and classmates may not understand the military lifestyle and experience, and that might impact engagement and participation of military connected students. So you did talk about faculty at higher ed and university perhaps being exposed, but what are your thoughts about the wider student body, or key parts of the wider student body being exposed to some of the experiences and background context of military connected students? Or is it not necessary, do you think?
No, I think it's a valuable part of the framework and the approach. At Fanshawe College, what they've done is clearly they're trying to attract the military connected students to their events, to their social support and peer events. But they've also opened it up and to all students on campus, and really try to recruit other students who want to learn more about military connected students, want to be a part of it, into their events. And a manner in which they did this was to recruit buy-in from the student government president. where, he has helped immensely in the formation of their military connected student club. So it's really, building it for the military connected students whilst simultaneously inviting other members to be part of that. I think it's it's a really good point. It's something that needs to continue to be fostered and cultivated, because they're all in class together. They're all learning together, and it goes back to I picked two themes of what I consider are unique to military-connected students, and it goes back to that adaptive value. I think the military-connected student brings adaptive value to the campus, and I think the military-connected student learns from traditional college and university students. They have two different lived experiences. So I think it's important to really form that inclusive environment. And I think all students after that will be better off for it. So I think that's an important point.
You talked about in the presentation, again, going back to educating the faculty and staff about this group of students as a group collectively, and you pointed out that no two students have the same experience before they come to the institution. So the question is, what do you see as key components of a curriculum that might educate faculty and staff at post-secondary and university level about the military culture and the military background? And I guess I'd add a second part to that question is, how important do you think it is that there is some sort of training or education for faculty and staff? And you did point out that military connected students tend to be slightly different in that they might be older. They've got a degree of lived experience in doing a range of things, etc. So they're not necessarily the same as the 18-year-olds that would be the normal student intake.
Yeah, so, three-part question there, Robert. Thank you for that. So I think it's important that faculty and staff really have a general understanding of where the military connected student is coming from. So we go back to that testimonial from the student who was able, she was a primary reservist, able to get on a training opportunity that was unexpected. So by educating, the faculty, they were well aware that this situation may come up. This situation is not going to come up all that often, but they were there and helped to support that student, her learning goals, and her military commitment. So it's important that the faculty have an appreciation of what military background is for a regular force or reserve force member in this case. Additionally, on the regular force side, we had one student who identified as regular force, and he reached out to us, and he was somebody who was deploying quite frequently with elements of the Royal Canadian Air Force, a technician who was deploying frequently. So by putting on these information sessions and having discussions with the faculty, they were able to better understand the challenges of trying to deploy, albeit for short periods of time, 2-3 weeks at a time, and maintain his college studies. So that was, I think, invaluable in terms of trying to support that. Secondly, I think it goes to creating an authentic relationship. If we look at, some veterans who may have served for 15 or 20, 25 years, and are going back to college or entering college or university for the first time, they're going to be closer in age and experience to a lot of the faculty and the staff than they are the students. So I think cultivating an authentic relationship and really having, that adult educator mindset, I think that goes a long way in truly supporting the academic success of military connected students. So ultimately, I think it's, how can we best create a positive environment? Just a couple of weeks ago, I had a training session with a number of intake advisors. They were getting, some questions on, what's it mean to be in the military? What's a military connected student? All of these things that we spoke of this evening. So I had a training session with them, and we were able to, to educate them to a point where, they could start cultivating a relationship right from the first phone call and email. And, I think that that really contributes to, how it contributes to organizational culture, and it contributes to how, that potential student sees that learning institution. So I think, it's really important to foster these genuine relationships.
Mm-hmm. And are there any aspects of that military background that are more important for faculty to understand than others, or is it just that broad overview of the factors and the experience?
I think what I tend to do is focus on the positive nature of interacting with Canada's military. We certainly talk about mental health. We certainly talk about well-being supports. But I provide some Veterans Affairs Canada stats on that, and just try and highlight that there are a lot of great success stories that come out of the military. So I think that's important, to try and tell good news stories when we're dealing with somebody with a mental health injury or some well-being, some potential well-being issues. It's to highlight the supports that I spoke of earlier, what's available at the national or regional level. So I think by doing that, I think that's important as well.
You talked about the barriers to moving forward in creating or developing a military connected institution. And there's a question here along that lines, and the question is, what would be your one nugget of advice, in this case for a pan-Canadian approach, and collaboration amongst post-secondary and higher ed, and not competition, to develop the frameworks and the models and the responses?
I would say, start the conversation. There are over 100 colleges, 100 universities in Canada. There's plenty of maneuver space, and every situation is going to be different. I provided a quick snapshot of some institutions I'm working with. Every single one of them, although they're in Ontario, we're a rather large province in Canada, they all have different factors in terms of their military connected population. They're not in competition with each other, regardless of geographic proximity. They're just not. So, I would say, start the conversation, share the models, especially at this early stage where we don't have, great empirical data on a lot of, on military connected students in Canada. We simply don't. So I think it's important to share that data. I think it's important to, to recognize that the space exists for a number of of initiatives. You know, and the other thing I would suggest, so I guess it's two nuggets, is that you know, just try not to focus on one element of the population, because there are going to be, as you start to unpack that, you're going to find out you have other elements of that military connected student population. You know, clearly, if you're doing a study or some research on one aspect, you know, that's not what I'm talking about. But when we're starting to you know, develop that some sort of support framework, wherever that may be, you know, make it as inclusive as it possibly can be.
And another question here. Do you have any data regarding psychosocial benefits associated with veterans, or I'd say the military connected group, studying on a military connected campus when compared with a campus that's not military connected? And you may not have the data, in which case, if you don't have the data, what are your preliminary thoughts from your work about that?
You know, I don't, but I want to partner with the individual who asked that question, because it sounds like an excellent opportunity to, you know, to conduct some really good research. So some preliminary thoughts, you know, I think just the positive benefits. Clearly, it's all anecdotal, but I think the positive benefits of education really help propel people in transition. Really help propel people who or went back to college or university for those professional development opportunities. You know, those individuals who are staying in the military. So I don't have the data, but I certainly would like to look into that. It's very interesting.
We've got another question here about people who have got disadvantage, and that can be for a range of reasons, and and are therefore already vulnerable before we look at the educational aspect. And so the question is, how do we go about supporting people from the military connected community who are vulnerable and who might not meet the traditional inclusion criteria to engage in post-secondary and higher education? And I guess I see it is if there's no VAC inclusion criteria or other criteria, what role do you think the institution itself can have through its own inclusion policies to support people from that background?
Yeah, you know, we recognize that military connected students they're not a homogeneous group. They're heterogeneous, come from all walks of life, and all backgrounds. Just recently, I've worked on contributing to a pathway for military connected students, regardless of background. It kind of ties in with prior learning assessment, but it's also an admissions pathway on how to get folks into the college. So, you know, I think folks who don't fall into those traditional categories, I think there's still a pathway that exists, and it's just, you know, how do we refine that pathway? How do we define it? How do we make it? How do we tailor it to be that inclusive tool we're trying to make it? You know, ultimately, I said a little while ago that this framework is about it's student centric. It's about the military connected student, and really to reduce all of those barriers to post-secondary and higher education. You know, so as we create these pathways, sure, some of it may be, you know, based on prior learning or experiential pathway, but we need to consider all of those other elements. You know, if somebody has expressed an interest in post-secondary education, they come from a military background, I'm quite certain, that we can really look at that and unpack that in a manner that's advantageous to that potential student.
I think it's a really important aspect because often, particularly institutions say, well, we need the formal structures outside to change. And one of the things that we've seen in a number of other areas is often institutions like higher ed and universities have, through their diversity and equity programs, have a lot of flexibility to do things if they choose to do them. Another question that's come in, which I think is a great question, is you talked about your definition of military connected, and the question is could you share how your perspective of this population has changed on the definition of a military connected student over the time? And the second part is, how can post-secondary and universities move from the current lens of veterans only to this broader understanding of the community that we're talking about here, or the possible group of potential students?
Yeah, certainly. So, initially I didn't consider foreign military veterans, and I really didn't consider Department of National Defense, so those civil servants who are part of the defense team, and that's part of the ever evolving process moving forward with this idea and this framework. Both of those categories came up because I ran into, hey, this individual is a Department of National Defense civil servant, and then I started to think about it and look at the linkages and the relationships with other military connected students, and it made sense. Foreign military veterans, we have a lot of we have a number of of folks who are dual citizens or join the American military and have access to the US GI Bill funding, come back to Canada for some schooling. So that just made sense to start looking at foreign military veterans. That in itself evolved because now we're start to talk about, yes, the United States is international, but we started to consider foreign military veterans who come from even further away, from Southeast Asia, as a matter of fact. So we're getting more foreign military veterans from other countries other than the United States. I think on the second part of the question, in terms of moving from veteran only to a greater population, I think it depends on the institution. If we're working on the west coast of Canada and it's predominantly a Navy base, well, then that needs to be their focus of their population. If there's an institution who's has a great track record in doing a lot of research on the veteran population, well, perhaps that's the focus of their population. It goes back to a couple of questions ago when we talked about that maneuver space. I think there's plenty of maneuver space in Canada for institutions to really tailor what element of the military connected population that they're looking at. I myself, I take a broader perspective. That I'm not conducting primary research at this point in time, right? This is more of a scholar practitioner model that aims to raise that awareness, develop it, and then, like one of the questions that was asked, and I want to partner with that individual, then we start some research. I kind of want to get the model out there. I want to get colleges and universities using it, and then tailor it as they move forward. So I think there's plenty of room for all of those different aspects. You know, if I was working with a college or university in our national capital in Ottawa, you know, perhaps it would be inundated with Department of National Defense civil servants, given that that's where the headquarters is at. But I think that tailorability is important. And I think that institutions need to maintain their flexibility to really explore and support their population that they have on hand.
Mm. So I think there are a couple of good points there. And then the other one is really, I think, that you raised is really, while they may have a particular focus, is to start to socialize the idea that that group that they're focused on is actually just but a part of what potentially is a broader community of individuals within a geographic area of operation. So thanks very much for that. And I think that's a great place to end the conversation today. I want to thank you very much, Darryl, for sharing your insights with us today. You've raised some really great points, but also I think you've pointed the way, particularly for institutions that are interested in exploring this domain, about things that they need to be thinking about or could be thinking about as they move forward with their plans. And so thank you for your contribution to the conversation around this topic. And we look forward to having you continue to contribute to the conversation as we move forward with this. And thank you to all of those of you who are still here and will be watching on delay. And I want to remind you that we will be having some more presentations around this topic about the role of education in enhancing lifelong well-being. And so the next one that will be in the education series will be on the 5th of May, where we'll hear from Scotland about the Scottish experience and perspective around this topic. So thank you everybody for your contribution today by joining us. We hope that you found the content useful and that it stimulates your thinking, and then as you engage with colleagues that you will take some of the ideas and concepts forward into those conversations. So thank you, and we look forward to having you join us when next we convene. Thanks everybody. Take care and have a wonderful rest of your day.